Hi, we're Fridays for Future Toronto, a youth-led organization that advocates for climate justice. On March 25th, all around the world, people are holding actions to protest the failure of governments and companies to address the climate crisis and the focus of the global strike, which is the hashtag People Not Profit. In this video, we're going to explain what this hashtag means, how it relates to the people being most affected by the climate crisis, and what this all has to do with the money that you put in your bank.
Climate change is here. We've all seen the devastation caused by extreme wildfires, floods, droughts, and storms. So long as we continue burning fossil fuels, these disasters will become more extreme and more frequent.
Climate change is affecting people everywhere, but it is not affecting us all equally. Many people, especially in rich countries, still feel like climate change is a faraway threat because their lives are being affected indirectly. However, millions of people's lives are being destroyed by climate change right now and have been for decades.
MAPA is a term used to describe this. It stands for Most Affected Peoples and Areas. These are the people on the front lines of the climate crisis, being directly impacted by it, as well as the lands that are bearing the brunt of its effects, like India and the Philippines. MAPA people are also the people on the front lines of climate activism. Because here's the issue. The people that caused this global emergency, being the richest people, lands, and nations, are not the ones who are currently feeling its worst impacts. The richest 1% of the world's population emits twice the greenhouse gases of the poorest 50%, and yet the poorest and most disadvantaged people are the ones who have to pay the most. A study from Stanford University found that the gap in income between the richest and poorest countries is around 25% higher than it would have been without the impacts of climate change.
Many MAPA live in the global south, places already affected by colonialism and systemic exploitation. Climate change is making all of the impacts that have been forced upon these communities that much worse. Farmers in India are watching their farms completely flood. People in Somalia, Kenya, and Syria are facing devastating food shortages because of massive droughts. In the Pacific Island regions, entire communities have been displaced because of rising sea levels. And the North American Black and racialized communities are often the most impacted by heat waves, air pollution, and a lack of aid during natural disasters and after them. This is a concept that is known as environmental racism.
Indigenous communities across the world are also being hit extremely hard by climate change. Many Indigenous cultures have a deep connection to the local environment, so their way of life is being deeply affected by changes to the ecosystems that have sustained traditional foods, medicines, and cultural practices for millennia. In Scandinavia, the Indigenous Sami people are seeing a decline in the reindeer population they depend on. In Brazil, Indigenous communities are being displaced by wildfires in the Amazon rainforest. In what we call Canada, Indigenous communities in the north are being displaced as the permafrost melts and as the ice retreats.
Many MAPA are facing severe effects of climate change right now, and they and we are resisting. MAPA people have been an integral part of the climate movement since its beginning, even though they are often overshadowed and their contributions are not acknowledged. MAPA represents the people part of People Not Profit, the people who are being the most neglected by our global society and who are fighting back fiercely.
The concept of MAPA is closely connected to colonialism. All around the world, foreign oil and mining companies come into poor countries promising to create jobs and transform the economy for the better. They then proceed to wreck ecosystems, emit huge amounts of greenhouse gases, and exploit local workers. And the money goes to the company's CEOs without improving the original economy one bit. In actively colonialist countries like the United States and Canada, domestic companies trample on the land rights of Indigenous peoples so that they can build environmentally destructive projects like pipelines. The easiest people to blame in these situations here are the companies actively doing this. But another type of company that is almost as bad, but not nearly acknowledged as much, is banks. Did you know that since 2016, the 5 main Canadian banks financed over $700 billion in fossil fuel projects? Banks probably aren't what you normally think of when you think about environmentally destructive companies, but they're actually some of the dirtiest in the world. The most destructive Canadian bank is RBC, which put over $208 billion into fossil fuels since 2016, and is the 5th worst bank in the world for funding fossil fuels. The other 4 of the big 5 Canadian banks are TD, Scotiabank, BMO, and CIBC. These banks are close behind RBC and are all funding billions of dollars to fossil fuel projects per year. When we say funding here, we're talking about banks giving these companies huge loans, underwritings, and investments they need to finance their projects. The banks are investing in fossil fuels and, by extension, environmental and social destruction.
RBC and these other big 5 Canadian banks also directly fund the construction of pipelines. They funded the Coastal GasLink pipeline, which is set to run through unceded Wet'suwet'en land. Peaceful Indigenous land protectors at the site were met with armed resistance from the RCMP. RBC also poured $2.75 billion into the Enbridge Line 3 pipeline expansion, which was constructed through Indigenous lands without consent and will threaten the Great Lakes and cause 193 million tons of greenhouse gas emissions every year.
These banks are actively funding the climate crisis. They are actively funding the flooding in India, the food insecurity in Central Africa, the burning, flooding, and desertification of Indigenous land. These banks are actively funding the devastation of our lives and our futures right now. This is the profit part of people, not profit. The banks will do whatever it takes to maximize their profits. And the key here is that if you or anyone you know has a bank account at one of the big 5 banks, those accounts are being used to provide opportunities for the banks to do this. We give the banks our money to keep it safe for the future, and they use it to destroy our future and our present.
The fact that it's our money, however, can also be a good thing, because it means that the power to make the banks stop funding the climate crisis is in our hands. It's not too late to show MAPA that their voices are being heard, and to demand action from the big banks. There are so many ways to do this, from writing letters to putting up posters to attending your bank's annual general meeting, and we've attached a toolkit in the description of this video to help walk you through how to take action. Be sure to share it with your friends and family as well. You see, many citizens of Canada, especially in Toronto, have the privilege of being insulated from many of the effects of climate change. But with this privilege comes a responsibility to push for the rights of those who are being affected, and to demand that our government and the banks do a better job of supporting these rights.
This is the essence of #PeopleNotProfit. And this is why we at Fridays for Future Toronto have been and continue to hold actions at banks to demand accountability. These companies solely care about money and not who or what their actions affect. By getting involved in this day of action, we can play a key role in showing banks that what really matters is people, not profit.